I'm going to talk about infrastructure. And the reason I'm going to talk about infrastructure is that the choices that we make over the next 15 years and then beyond that, the choices we make about the infrastructure that gets built across the world will be absolutely central. In fact, they will be the single most important determinant, both of the forms of economic growth that we have and also the extent to which we are able to deliver that growth in a way that meets climate targets. So while you may have heard many, many other things, I'd like us to spend the next half hour focusing particularly on the patterns, shapes, financing requirements, and policy regimes that will be essential to the right infrastructure. Because if we build the right infrastructure over the next 15 to 20 years, we give ourselves half a chance, and only half a chance, of getting close to a well below 2-degree world. And if we don't, then we are stuffed. And it is that simple. And so the secretary, the minister, deputy who was here before, Rainer Bacher, was 95% right on what he said. But one thing and I agreed with 95% of it, but the 5%, which is critical, with which I disagree, is that, in fact, if you want to get infrastructure right, government can't just step back and let the market do it. It has to be deeply, heavily, intimately in the mix. And it is not enough just to set a target and say the market will sort itself out, because it won't. And we know that from hundreds and hundreds of years. The reason that Berlin looks the way it does, the best bits of Berlin, are not just a function of market forces, because if we left it just to the market, we would have a complete urban chaos and sprawl, which is in fact what we have in many parts of the world. So, with that, I'm going to talk about infrastructure, hopefully, if I can get this up on the screen. And I'm going to talk about sustainable infrastructure, because infrastructure comes in all shapes and sizes. I'm going to give it a broad definition, but I'm particularly concerned about the way cities develop, because they are integral to the next era of economic growth and development across the world. I mean, I just need to remind us all, and you all know this, right? But 80 million people every year are urbanizing across the world. 1 billion people, roughly, over the next 12 to 15 years. So how we urbanize the next billion people will either be the biggest generator of a low-carbon economy because we actually urbanize them in the right way, right? Or it will be a disaster, right? And we will lock in to an unsustainable, inefficient, and socially inequitable form of urbanization that will have implications for all of us across the planet. So I care particularly about the urban form of infrastructure, but in there is embedded the power systems, the transport systems, the water and sanitation systems, right? What we take for granted here. I should remind us, I know we've spoken mainly about climate here, right? But the reality, notwithstanding Paris, and the problem in some sense with Paris, is that people have done Paris tick, done, and now let's get back to life, right? To a significant extent. Right? And so what we have to do every single time we talk about climate is to show how it links into the real economic development priorities that countries hold for themselves, and the way in which they frame and pose the political and social goals that they hold. Right? And so the approach to infrastructure sits if you go to China and India and Indonesia and almost all the developing countries where 80% of the infrastructure is going to get built, and where at least 2/3 of the economic growth are going to happen over the next 15 years, this is the conversation, right? And yes, they think hard about climate, right? These are, in many respects, very sophisticated, thoughtful political systems that are thinking hard about climate in the context of economic growth, in the context of urbanization, and actually in the context of the broader sustainable development goals. Right? So if we cannot demonstrate that we have got an approach and an agenda that integrates into that broader frame, then we will not win this debate. right? However smart and sophisticated our approach to power system market design might be in Europe, right? Most people outside Europe, just to remind us all, look at what's going on with the European electricity sector and think it's a disaster, right? And they think it's a disaster partly because they can't quite understand the negative prices and all that stuff, but partly because they look at it and see Europe as essentially low growth, and therefore what we have is a challenge of excess energy, right, and surplus electricity because we're a low growth part of the world. And that is their frame on the European power transition overall. So we've got to think broadly about the approach that we're taking. Now I'm going to rattle through a few slides, and you know, again, these are things that you know, but I want just to make sure that we have got them absolutely in the center of our attention. So the infrastructure that we build, and I am using it broadly to include quite a broad amount of the building stock that gets built, as well as the transport systems, as well as the power systems associated with urbanization. 60% plus of the emissions, right? And the choices we make now, not in 2030 or 2050, will set us up on pathways of one form or another. Right? That's the way infrastructure works. It creates immense pathway dependency. Right? If you start building things at the edge of a city, you create ever more incentives to have even more on the edge of the city. So it's not about, I should say, I think much of our economic modeling, right, and the computable general equilibrium models that we have used to generate many of the results that you've heard about this morning and in other settings, they're partly right, but they're often very deeply misleading. Right? You will not find the notion of a city anywhere in a CGE model. They cannot model the critical institutional features of a modern economy. They struggle deeply with network effects, which, as we know, in modern economies play a fundamental role because they have to solve out without those being embedded in the logic. So we've got to think about this with the right set of models. We've got to think about it in the context of the relationship of growth and structural transformation of economies. And we've got to think about it in the context of what people care about. Right? People actually do care about improved education, improved access to water, gender equality. We've got to frame our conversation in the terms that matter to people, which in many parts of the world includes climate, but is not only about climate. Now, we know these numbers. These are numbers that were generated in 2014 by the New Climate Economy team that I led. And we can debate forever whether the investment requirements over the next 15 years are $90 trillion in infrastructure or 80 or 100. Everyone has slightly different numbers. But it's in the order of $5 to $6 trillion a year. That's a huge, we all throw around trillions nowadays. It's a very big number, right? You spend $5 to $6 trillion on the right stuff, and it drives change in a deep way because it drives, just as has happened here in Germany, that the investment in solar was a gift to the world. It cost Germany a lot, right? But it was a gift to the world because it drove down the solar cost curve for the world. So how we spend the 5 to 6 trillion, do we spend it on renewable energy? Do we spend it on buildings with new materials? Do we spend it on public transport systems that operate in a different way? Do we do all of those things so that we drive down the cost curve of all those technologies and then make them available globally or not? This is a massive deal. All the analysis that comes out of New Climate Economy, the International Energy Agency, you name it, will tell you that whether you choose to invest in a low carbon economy or a high carbon economy, the infrastructure requirements in the aggregate are roughly $5 to $6 trillion a year, right? It's not a different number to go low carbon. It's just that you have to invest in radically different things. So we have to then get our markets and our policy settings and our regulatory choices geared up to make a different set of investment, to allocate the capital differently. And I can tell you that the institutional investors will go there if the regulatory signals are right, They will not go there if the signals are wrong. It's, again, that simple. We know that there's a huge scale-up, and this was an observation made earlier, right? We need to at least double the scale of infrastructure investment, right? We need to double it, and we need to change the way it flows, and so that it flows into different things, so that it doesn't flow into urban development on the edge, but it flows into compact, connected cities with decent public transport systems, or that it flows into power systems that are essentially zero carbon, right? And then it flows from there into networks and infrastructure that allows for electrification of transport and electrification of heating. That's what we will need to do. But we will need to do it at scale. And in all of this, of course, is a huge opportunity, because if we could do this at scale, right, we solve a number of problems in addition to the climate problem, right? Because we also solve the question of how to allocate capital that is currently sitting deployed not particularly well in a very low interest rate regime. We open up the door for that capital deployment at scale to invest in productive assets that can drive economic growth across the world, and that can help us actually with some of the miserably low returns that sit within the asset management industry. So there are huge, huge gains if we can get this right, not just from a climate perspective, but from an integrated economic logic. We think about this, and we need to think about it differently. If we think about building infrastructure in exactly the same way as we've thought about it historically, we will get it wrong, right? We will get it wrong because traditional infrastructure models have been typically very centralized in their formulation. They have often generated immense rent and corruption, and we should be clear about this as we go into an infrastructure boom across the world economy. Anybody who thinks it will happen in a rent-free way is, again, in fantasy land, right? So we have to think about how to do infrastructure really differently, particularly if we want to attract any cross-border capital at scale into infrastructure. And this is simply to, I don't know if you can read it, but it's just to say that the entities that will be playing in this game will not always be large central governments, right? It will have to be a whole bunch of hundreds and hundreds of cities that will need to generate for themselves a degree of creditworthiness to be able to access capital markets, domestic and international. And these are cities whose names you and I have never heard of, let alone being able to pronounce, right? Hundreds of them, if not thousands, across the world that will be at the heart of this urban. So that is what we have to put in place. And that is itself a form of infrastructure which enables, if you will, capital to flow into a different class of counterparties. This is roughly where the money needs to go. Right? Having talked about the big numbers, let me just stick with very big numbers, but I'll move them into slightly more parsable categories. And this is to just remind us that the infrastructure investment on which the entire, or 80% of the story of moving to a low-carbon economy depends on this, right? It depends on this, has to happen predominantly in middle-income countries, and it's predominantly around, a combination of, transport and power, and of course there's a whole building story wrapped into this as well. So we've got to see huge shifts in capital allocation into these asset classes. And we've got to think about, and apologies for the somewhat complex nature of this exhibit, we've got to think about where this capital is going to come from. Now, what's really interesting, right, if you want to dig down into the kind of the financing side of this. So first thing that's really interesting is that in the middle income countries, and it's not just China, it's also India, but it's also a number of them, is where assets under management in the institutional investment world are growing the fastest, right? All infrastructure, the history of infrastructure is that it has a very large component of domestic financing. Right? And the reason for that is because it generates revenues in one form or another, either through the way in which the market is set up or through tax revenues that are domestically denominated. It is extremely hard for infrastructure to be 80% financed by foreign capital. It's really hard, and it rarely happens. And when it does happen, like in Argentina in the whenever it was 1870s or something, it was a disaster. The good news on the infrastructure story and the infrastructure financing story is that there's a massive growth of assets under management in the middle income countries. And as you can see from this, while there is significant flow from high income to middle income for infrastructure development, already we're seeing the middle income countries doing most of the financing, and that's going to grow and grow and grow. And of course, I sit there as a guy in the UK watching China invest, along with France, maybe, in our nuclear power system, which is a whole other story. If anybody wants to have my views on that, I can offer them offline and loudly. So we've got this emergent story of middle incomes being able to self-finance a very large proportion of their infrastructure development, but where actually, if you could drill one more time into the data, and you click one more time, the most important thing that you wouldn't exactly see from this page is a dramatic growth of Chinese capital flowing into all the other middle-income countries. And so if you want to look at the players who are going to drive infrastructure development across the middle-income countries, where 70% of the infrastructure is going to get built, 60 to 70, look and understand what the Chinese institutions are choosing to do. And if you're not following that, you're not following the big trend in the game. Just very quickly on the low-income countries, which represent a tiny, tiny fraction of the total infrastructure, 5 to 10%. But the infrastructure, therefore, is so critical because if you, instead of looking at money, looked at numbers of people, which we should care about. We should think about the world in terms of people, not just in terms of CO2 emissions. That is where small additions in infrastructure make the biggest difference, right, to the lives of hundreds, if not billions of people. And the models aren't there yet, right? The models are simply not there. There's too much money coming in from outside. There's not enough domestic resource mobilization. We do not have the public-private partnership models working there. We do not have the development banks, the KfWs, the DFIDs. They are not getting their act together in the right way in these countries yet. And it's partly a challenge within the countries themselves. Let's not kid ourselves. But we have got to figure out a way through some of this. Because these are countries which are sowing the seeds of the cities and the power systems and the transport systems, which will then, if one way or another, grow and scale over the coming 30 to 50 years. And this is where, of course, where all the population growth increasingly is taking place. What's making all this difficult? There's a wonderful opportunity. There's $5 to $6 trillion a year to invest in, right? There's vast amounts of capital earning inadequate returns to fund our pensions here in the developed world. There ought to be intermediation capacity generated through the international financial system, including the elements of that came out of the Paris Agreement, including the commitments of I'm an ex-World Banker, right? And what needs to happen in not just the World Bank, but across the multilateral development banks is to take what is a dreadfully inadequate track record in infrastructure investment. They are investing 40 billion roughly a year at the moment, and they need to be moving that to 200 to 300 billion a year. And these are the institutions that can actually, if you will, help with lubricating international capital flow into infrastructure. But there are a set of issues, right? And they're not trivial, right? Countries on the whole, and Germany may be an honourable exception, right? Do not have proper infrastructure plans. They do not lay out what the next 20, 30 years of infrastructure development. You cannot get these plans well enough specified. And because the plans are not well specified and they're not well anchored, you then struggle to turn that into policy, and it then struggles to turn into projects, and then everything, if you will, sort of becomes more difficult after that. Right? So the one thing about infrastructure, which is extremely old-fashioned and it became very unfashionable, right, in the era of markets, is that you actually need to plan this stuff. Right? You can't just make it up and hope it works out. Right? There is genuine benefit of planning. There is a challenge in planning, right? Because the technologies are changing reasonably fast. Social conditions are changing fast, and so I think we should acknowledge that actually getting the planning right, which with enough fixed variables in there and enough flex to allow for uncertainty, is a new set of skills and capabilities around which we need to develop capabilities and instruments. But the fundamentals of it are reasonably straightforward and have not changed, right, in hundreds of years. I mean, if you look at the beauty of the Paris built by Baron von Haussmann, right, those skills appear to have endured remarkably well. So there are some genuine challenges, and I don't want to pretend that it's a question of looking at a PowerPoint set of exhibits produced by a bunch of consultants and you think it's going to all get fixed, right? This does require a decade or more of absolute focus, of putting our best capabilities against it, of working through how to take the expertise from Germany and other countries and make it, if you will, transplant it in the right way into a set of other countries. But it does require us to take this agenda on and do it with aggression and ambition, because anything short of that will fail. Right? Anything that looks like business as usual on infrastructure is not going to do the trick. Right? And it doesn't matter how much we fix things here, if we don't get this international agenda right, particularly for the middle income and low income countries, and figure out how to take the expertise and the know-how and the learning and the challenges that we're all wrestling with here, and not just try and superimpose them on developing countries, because they don't have to deal with the retrofit problem of lignite coal-fired power stations. They've got a different set of problems. How to help them actually take their agenda forward on the infrastructure, city, urban, power, transport, and sanitation fronts and make it work. That is our collective, most important challenge if we care both about climate and economic growth and the Sustainable Development Agenda. Now, we get this right, and there are lots of opportunities to scale up the capital that gets deployed. I'm happy to take questions on any of the numbers here, but we tried to think through how to get to the 6 trillion a year. And it's never one set of actors. It's not just governments, and it's not just the private sector, and it's not just institutes. It's a combination, and it's an artfully constructed combination of them. And let me, in a sense, just finish here. If you want to be entirely self-centered for a moment and think about this from an investment perspective as opposed to from a save the world and feed the world perspective, if we could get this agenda right, there is a set of investment opportunities that inevitably will have to go from the super high level to individual specific projects with specific project returns and specific leverage ratios and all the rest of it, and swaps against, currency risk, all of that. But done well, this is the biggest investment opportunity of our generation, and it happens to be one that could make all the difference in terms of the transition to a low-carbon economy. So let me stop there, and thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to take any questions.